All right, Sanjeev, you want to go ahead and get started?
Certainly. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sanjeev Verma, co-founder of PreVeil, a provider of end-to-end encrypted email and file sharing systems for storing and sharing controlled and classified information to meet DFARS, CMMC, and ITAR. So the topic of today's webinar is CMMC updates and understanding your DFARS obligations. The topics are closely tied together. If you are a current contractor handling controlled and classified information, it means you have a DFARS 7012 clause in your contract that you need to abide by today. It also means that when CMMC becomes the law, you will be required to get audited by a certified third-party assessment organization or a C3PAO to validate that you meet your current DFARS requirements. Our webinar has three objectives. Our first objective is to provide you with a clear understanding of your DFARS obligations and map them to 4 compliance requirements that you must meet. Our second objective is to provide you an update on the CMMC program. And our third objective is to provide you with 7 questions a C3PAO or a DIBCAC, which is the Department of Defense's auditor, will ask you to determine if you're ready for an assessment. This is an important check that you can perform yourself. DFARS and CMMC are open book tests, so it's important for you to know the questions you will be asked and what constitute adequate answers versus potential red flags. Our panelists today are among the very best compliance resources in industry. Stuart Itkin is Vice President in charge of Coalfire Federal's CMMC, DFARS, and FedRAMP assessment practice. And Coalfire is arguably one of the biggest certified third-party assessment organizations in the country. So his perspective is an excellent proxy for what your auditors will ask you when you go for an assessment. Regan Edens is a renowned compliance guru. That's the way I will refer to him. He's a former board member of the CMMC accreditation body. I know few who can rival his depth of understanding of DFARS and CMMC. And he recently guided an organization to a successful CMMC audit under the Department of Defense's Joint Surveillance Program. So welcome, Stuart and Regan. Let's get started. So the first question goes out as follows. If you handle controlled and classified information, you are legally and contractually obligated to meet DFARS 7012 and soon 7019 and 20. Can either of you summarize what these requirements entail? Regan, you want to start?
And Regan, you're on mute.
That's the famous answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you, Sanjeev. As always, it's great to be with you and the audience. And my apologies for being so informal. I was doing a tornado cleanup here in Houston, Texas with my parents. So the answer is yes. The DFARS 7019, 7020 are 2 contract clauses that are active and final rules as of December 1st of 2022. So both of those requirements likely exist in many of the webinar attendees' contracts, existing contracts that have been renewed or that have been updated since the interim rule was released on November 30th of 2021. So just to summarize, the DFARS 252, 204, 7019, and 7020 are existing final rules right now. Those 2 final rules require several different things. The first thing is that the SPRS system has been a system established by the Defense Contract Management Agency to establish compliance, self-attestation-based compliance with the current DFARS 7012 rule. And the way to get to establish that score is through the 7019 provides for you to conduct a self-assessment using a very specific methodology, the DoD self-assessment methodology, the version 1.1. And to conduct that methodology in a summary score and provide, and also to provide and maintain sufficient evidence to justify that score. Two components. One is that the self-assessment is conducted. The second one is to have and maintain the evidence that supports and justifies the score that you've attested to. The third aspect to the 7019-7020 is that score is filed with the federal government in the SPRS system and becomes a part of your permanent record. And the government expects to see progress from that initial score all the way up through until the score has finally fully been met and the plan of action milestones has been completed. The top score is 110. The bottom score is a negative 203. The fourth aspect to that, the requirement is that the SPRS system and the methodology used to conduct your own self-assessment also has provisions for the Defense Contract Management Agency to do a medium assessment and a high assessment. I won't belay those details. But the other aspect of it that the 7019 and 7020 provide is that a prime contractor or a higher tier subcontractor can use the exact same methodology to assess compliance of its supply chain. So those are what the 7019 and the 7020 rule provide for currently right now. Last component. One thing is that if you do not, if you haven't conducted the 7019 and 7020, the basic self-assessment, and provided for the score, you are not currently eligible for the contracts that you have, nor, or unless you comply with these requirements, are you eligible to award a contract to any subcontractors that help you perform the contract that is required of you related to the DoD. Whether you're a prime contractor and you're awarding subcontractors, or whether you're a higher tier subcontractor awarding lower tier subcontractors. So you have to execute the requirement, you have to file the SPRS score, and so do all the subsequent subcontractors that's impacted by the requirements have to conduct the basic self-assessment and also file that score.
And I'll add, Regan, that we've had kind of panicked contractors and subcontractors come to us when they did not receive an award that they expected, simply because they were told by the contracting officer, you don't have a current score that has been submitted to SPRS. And the requirement is that a current score needs to have been submitted within 3 years of the award for either an initial or for a renewal of an award. But I think more fundamentally, we talked about 7019 and 7020. 7012 has been a requirement. It came out in I guess in 2017, in the end of the year, was stated as a requirement for every organization that that handles, processes, or transmits CUI are subject to the provisions of 7012. And that includes compliance with NIST 800-171, the foundation for the 7019 and 7020 clauses, and it includes other provisions as well. But the 7012 clause, the requirement to comply with all requirements of NIST 800-171 is nothing that is new. And when organizations say, well, gee, this is a new requirement, it's not a new requirement. I think what the issue is really now more of one of enforcement and the recognition of how important it is for organizations to be able to achieve kind of that minimum threshold of cybersecurity that's required to be entrusted with controlled and classified information.
Yeah, I would agree. Just a little bit of a follow-on there is that prime contractors are before they award contracts, are checking for an SPRS score, and that is essential. And contracting officers are currently enforcing those requirements and removing companies from eligibility if they do not have a current score. So it's very important that folks, if you're not familiar with these terms, you need to be absolutely familiar with the details of these requirements for the DFARS 7019, the DFARS 7020, and the SPRS requirements. And those are all, you can Google them and find out the details.
But thank you for providing a baseline that 7012 is the 110 NIST 800-171 requirements, and you gave a very eloquent understanding of 19 and 20. My follow-up question is, are 70, 12, 19, and 20 just sort of arbitrary, one-off rules, or are they linked to each other? Is there logical linkage between 12, 19, and 20?
Yeah, there is actually. What they've done, Sanjeev, and this is very important for people to pay attention to the details here. What they've done, the DoD, when they established the 7012, and as Stuart astutely stated, that the effective date for that was December 31st of 2017. So when they established that the requirement for that, there wasn't a directly a means of enforcement. The DPCAC or the DCMA had to build an enforcement team, in which they've been very deliberate in doing over the last 3 years. I was fortunate enough to train most of the original provisional assessors within the DPCAC program, and during my time on the accreditation body as the standards chief. So as they built that capability, coinciding with that capability to reinforce DoD policy, they established the 7019 and the 7020 that was issued along with the CMMC rule, the original CMMC rule. Both of those rules were interim rules. The CMMC rule was pulled back, as everyone knows, from CMMC 1.0 to CMMC 2.0, but the 7019 and the 7020 have continued to move along. And so now that the 7019 and 7020 are final rules. So there's no repeal. They're not going away. The 7012 is not going away. So as people look forward to the CMMC rule coming out in the spring, they should not be distracted by the current standing requirements related to 7012 and related to 7019 and 7020, because I fully expect the Defense Contract Management Agency to aggressively enforce the 7019 and the 7020 this year, building up to the CMMC rule that will be released in the spring.
Yeah, and I think the relationship is a little bit more fundamental. I mean, if we stand back, 7012 was put in place with the 800-171 compliance requirement, with the belief that organizations were going to satisfy those controls and satisfy them in a way that what they did was effective in reducing the leakage of CUI, and it wasn't. I mean, we know the story that self-assessments proved to be ineffective, and so the 19, 20, and 21 rules that were published were really all about enforcement and kind of hierarchical enforcement to ensure that organizations were going through doing self-assessments and submitting those self-assessments and including a date by which they expected to have any deficiencies or any POAM items remediated within that. The 20 provided the DBCAC the mechanism to be able to go in and create to perform a 5-day or medium assessment, to be able to go and say, okay, we want to check to see that you've really done the things that you've done. And ultimately 21 provided for third-party assessment, a step that ultimately will occur when the CMMC final rule is enacted, and all organizations need to be assessed by C3PAOs or third-party assessment organizations. But this is about enforcement, and it's not just the 19 and 20 being the mechanisms for enforcement. We're seeing that the 19 rule being enforced through contracting, where contract agents are looking and saying, you not only do you need to have a score, but you need to have a minimum threshold score to be acceptable. 5-day audits that I mentioned, again, another mechanism that's available to enforce that organizations are being compliant. Primes are the ones that are accepting the risk of their subcontractors. And, we absolutely expect to see primes, again, enforcing the requirements and ensuring that their subs and their sub-subs have satisfied the requirements of 7012, because that's really what will mitigate their risk. Beyond that, there are initiatives like Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, False Claims Act. All of these are kind of clubs in the bag of the DBCAC to be able to ensure that organizations are complying with the requirements of 800-171 and achieving that minimum threshold of security that the government feels is essential to be entrusted with controlled and classified information.
Well, thank you. Let's, pretty clear that 7012 is the NIST 800-171 controls, and in common parlance, 7019 is your SPRS score, which indicates how well you comply with those NIST 800-171 requirements. And I often refer to the SPRS score as your SAT, because now you've got a mechanism to measure, how you performed on your compliance. So let's move on to the next phase of our questions. Suppose you've got a DFARS 7012 clause in your contract. Both of you have highlighted frequently that there are 4 high-level compliance requirements one must pay attention to. Can you, for the defense contractors and higher education institutions in the audience, describe what these 4 high-level compliance requirements are if you have these DFARS clauses in your contract?
I think, it starts, as we said, with compliance with NIST 800-171, but there are other provisions that exist within the DFARS 7012. They include what's referred to as paragraphs C through G that provide a reporting requirement if an organization suffers a breach or detects malware, and requires reporting back to the government and a mechanism for being able to, to achieve that. There's a requirement to flow these requirements down to any subcontractor with whom you exchange CUI, so that if you're providing CUI or know that somebody who's a subcontractor is handling processing or transmitting CUI, you need to transmit those or flow those requirements down, and you have a responsibility to audit that in fact they have satisfied those requirements to be, again, to have satisfied NIST 800-171. There's the requirement for a cloud service that you use if that cloud service is used to be able to, again, store, process, or transmit CUI, then it must meet or satisfy the requirements of the FedRAMP moderate baseline, which there are several ways that that it can do. And finally, there's the requirement for FIPS 140-2 validated encryption. And these are kind of the fundamental requirements that exist within the DFARS 7012. And Regan, anything to add to that?
Well, I think that when we're looking at the fundamentals, the key pieces that you addressed are right on target. And if we look at the DCMA audit results on those 5-day notice audits that you mentioned just previously, there are 2 major components that you can really assess from that score and from the DCMA data. One is that none of the organizations fully met requirements, number one. That was, and about 75% of the organizations had reported a perfect score. Okay, so that's a huge warning and should be a red flag to everyone. The second one is that about 75% of the organizations had major deficiencies, meaning that if 75% of the organizations reported a perfect score, their reality is that the DIBCAC found major deficiencies in 75% of those organizations. So now we have two sort of critical judgments that we can walk away from and take from the data. One is that organizations do not fully understand the requirements, and they're not implementing the requirements correctly, and they're scoring themselves with a much higher score than what would be expected if a third party were conducting that audit. So that's a major warning. The other second major warning away from that is that most organizations did not have sufficient evidence to justify that score. Yep. And that sufficient evidence standard is identical across all 4 requirements. It's identical for the 7012, for the 7019, for the 7020, and it will be the same evidentiary standard for the CMMC certification. So it's very important that people realize when they have an expectation that they're at such and such SPRS score, do they really understand the requirements? Right. Number one. And second is, do they really have sufficient evidence to justify the score that they provided for themselves?
Yeah, and that's, one of the, the 2 main reasons DIBCAC cites why organizations fail on assessment. One is either inadequate or insufficient documentation. and the documentation requirement, again, is very, very specific. And the other is kind of mischaracterization of their CUI boundary. But that said, I go back to a point that Sanjeev made at the beginning of this discussion. This is an open book test. And while people talk in terms of 110 requirements or practices, there are really 320 assessment objectives that are in the CMMC Level 2 assessment guide. And those are very objectively the things that you need to satisfy. And in order to be able to get a 110 or perfect score against 800-171, it's a matter of being able to answer yes to having satisfied all 320 of those assessment objectives in the way that it's described in the assessment guide. So it is an open book test, but you're right. Too many organizations kind of either use their own interpretation or give themselves the benefit of the doubt. And again, that's why we're seeing escalating levels of enforcement to ensure that there is no ambiguity and that organizations truly are achieving that level of security that is required.
Yep.
Thank you for that clarification. I want to summarize. A lot has been said, but the 4 high-level compliance requirements that you've highlighted an organization should pay attention to is first that they meet NIST 800-171's 110 controls, that their systems satisfy the C through G incident reporting requirements, which are specific. General purpose, systems don't automatically satisfy them. And that it's a responsibility, if you're storing and sharing CUI, to ascertain that the cloud vendor is FedRAMP baseline moderate or equivalent, and if encryption is being used, it's FIPS 140-2. Let's move on for the next 5 minutes to a question that's on the minds of a great many, which is, how does CMMC relate to these DFARS regulations that you have described? And even more importantly, what updates can you share with us on the program and its timelines? And we want you to stick to about 5 minutes for that, because we're going to then move on to the next section, which is you conducting an open book test for a dummy organization. So please go ahead.
Stuart, do you want to hit number 1 and I'll follow up on the update?
I was going to say, let me start with the kind of the timeline a little bit. And I don't think anybody has a perfect crystal ball, but the thing that we know is that the process is proceeding and progressing. That we expect to see a rule published for comments, either later this spring or very early in the summer, most likely at that point. And that can be an interim rule. It can be an in-process rule. There'll be a 60-day comment period, but once the rule is then finalized, it goes into effect and it becomes essentially the law that CMMC can be put into contract clauses requiring organizations to have a third-party assessment against level 2 before they are eligible to receive a contract. But the net of it is, again, it goes back to the earlier comments. It really doesn't matter. CMMC is another enforcement mechanism to ensure that organizations are complying with NIST 800-171, and that requirement to comply with NIST 800-171, as well as the rest of the provisions in the 7012 DFARS clause, all applies today. So, Regan?
Yeah, I would agree. I think with the when we see the interim rule, or rather when we see the CMC rule released in the spring, remember that that language will be go up for a 60-day review, and the machine will continue to drive on. So it's very important that everyone realize that CMMC is the implementation of DFARS as it's worded right now underneath the Federal Registry in the current rule, which I do not expect it to change. That CMMC certification is simply the third-party certification of the implementation of the NIST 800-171 as required by the DFARS 7012. So remember, folks, CMMC is not going to displace the DFARS 7012. CMMC will not displace the 7019. CMMC will not displace the 7020. It's simply the third-party certification. But when they say, as required by DFARS 7012, listen, folks, there's a lot of details in there. There's a lot of details that you have to meet, first starting with the DFARS 7012 and all the requirements, both basic and specified, the 7019 and the 7020, as we've described during this webinar. And then we come along with third-party certification with CMMC. So at the end of the day, the DoD is trying to cover the best interest of both the DoD Defense Industrial Base and, of course, the DoD interest, national security interest, to protect the information itself. So take this time, understand what is most important, and then continue that trek as the dust settles in the language is during the release of the language expected in May.
So one follow-up question over here. Again, the DoD has emphasized in their June memo of last year that failure to meet 7012 and implement 800-171 is deemed a material breach of contract. And as you clarified, CMMC is the ultimate enforcement mechanism for it through third-party audits. Can you, gentlemen, clarify? You use the term interim rule and final rule. Could you give the audience a little bit more color on what's an interim rule and what's a NPRM final rule? Because it may not be readily apparent to our audience.
Yeah, I'll kick this off and then Stuart can follow up. Listen, folks, there's a lot of minutia detail, right? And we're very much in the weeds when it comes to these things. So we'll describe it and then try to summarize what you need to
may I interrupt? You're absolutely my friend, always in the weeds.
Let me try to
speak to an intelligent audience at a simple.
Okay, go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, and so as Regan indicated, the rule will be published this spring. The difference between and independent of whether it's an interim rule or an in-process rule, there will be a 60-day comment period. And the difference is that an interim rule becomes enacted, it becomes law, it goes into effect after that 60-day comment period. And an in-process rule, the comments are adjudicated before that rule becomes finalized. But again, I'll come back to the point where, when that occurs, it doesn't really matter because this is a requirement today with other mechanisms of enforcement. Yep. CMMC will just become kind of the ultimate means of ensuring that organizations are satisfying these requirements in a manner that is consistent with the assessment objectives in the assessment guide.
So in essence, what you're saying is, in lay terms, if I am filing as a business my own tax, financial statements, CMMC is the equivalent of, if I have a financial statement, I need to have an audited financial statement from a firm that vouches for the authenticity. And that's basically the final mechanism that the DoD is looking for. So let's move on to, you mentioned the fact that, 7012, which is 800-171 requirements are enforced, and multiple firms are getting a call from DIBCAC. DIBCAC is the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. It's the Department of Defense's internal audit agency to verify compliance. So suppose you are one of the companies that gets a call from DIBCAC that says, hey, you filed your SPR score, we want to go and take a look at it. Or you want to yourself determine for yourself that, look, am I ready to demonstrate objectively that I meet DFARS to either a prime or, ascertain whether you are CMMC ready. There are some questions that you ought to be asking yourself. And Stuart and Regan have provided me with 7 questions in an open book test format that an organization will be asked by either DIBCAC, or if Stuart's C3PAO would be looking into your organization, they'd ask the same question. And so I'm going to ask them these 7 questions and get their responses to show what represents adequate preparation and what might be lack thereof. So the first question that you're likely to be asked is, what is the date and title of your most recent system security plan. How does your system security plan describe compliance with each NIST 800-171 control? Fire away. What is an appropriate answer and what would indicate red flags?
I think the appropriate answer is yes, we have one. The date is earlier than today, and that it addresses all of those requirements. I mean, the fundamental requirement, even to be able to calculate an SPRS score, is that you have an SSP. The SSP describes what your security plan is. It specifically describes how you've satisfied those 110 practices, the 320 requirements or assessment objectives that go under those 110 practices. And it's a fundamental requirement. If you don't have one, you're absolutely not ready to go through the process. And if you don't have one, boy, you better get a time machine and kind of go back 18 months and get started, because it takes a long time to be able to go through the process of, it's not writing the SSP, it's putting in place the security controls, the policies and procedures that enable you to have an SSP that satisfies those requirements.
Yeah, and I'll just take a step, just elaborate a bit. Yeah.
May I ask a question? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
When you add color, could you provide the audience some sense of, how big an SSP is? Because again, the defense industrial base varies from very sophisticated organizations that have compliance staffs in them to 80% that are small to medium businesses that don't have compliance personnel, that don't speak the compliance language. So for them, can you provide some color and guidance for what constitutes an adequate, system security plan? Sorry to interrupt you.
No, you were actually reading my mind. That's exactly what I was about to comment on. So what's interesting about these requirements, folks, is that people believe, because I'm a smaller organization, right? I mean, DTC Global handles very large, prime contractors and even tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 contractors to the smallest, prime contractor down to the smallest 27th tier subcontractor. And the reality is that the requirements are identical for everyone. So please do not be sort of molded into a false sense of security, either that you have this gigantic, 2,000-page system security plan, or that you have a 5-page system security plan. The 5-page system security plan is woefully inadequate. And quite frankly, it is not uncommon for a system security plan to be 250 to 500 pages. Right. The reason for that is because remember that you're describing two fundamental things. It is how you meet requirements or how you plan to meet requirements. And then you've got a bunch of addendums and attachments and so on and so forth. And the reality is that the description of meeting those requirements should require sufficient detail that the assessor, the government, your prime contractor, whomever is reviewing that system security plan, understands the exact current status of the organization. Remember also that the system security plan is a cornerstone of all of your documentation for evidence. It is not the only piece. You'll conduct a risk assessment, that's documented. A security control assessment, that's documented. Your plan of action milestones is a required document of evidence underneath the DoD assessment methodology. So these documents provide a path and provide you sort of an overview for an assessor, whomever that might be, to review where did the organization start with their initial, say, risk assessment, or their initial security control assessment, or their initial system security plan, and where over a given period of time of a timeline and progress, where are they now? All that should provide a very clear and concise picture of the maturity of your organization as you've progressed in meeting requirements up until, of course, wherever you're at the time of the assessment or the time of the system security plan review.
Question number 2. Have you performed a self-assessment? And if so, how many plans of action and milestones that you have outstanding, when do you expect them to be completed? So POAMs, how many do you have? When do you expect them to be completed? So what's a good answer that seems reasonable? What's inadequate?
Yeah, so go ahead.
I was going to say a good answer is yes, we have performed a self-assessment. Yes, we performed a self-assessment because it is a requirement. It's a requirement that it's done annually, even though under CMMC, the certification is only something that happens once every 3 years. And the SSP, as a result of that, needs to be updated at least once a year. But again, this is a matter of trying to assess, are you ready? And if you haven't done a self-assessment, if you don't know how many POAM items that you have, it's unlikely that you've satisfied all of those items and that you're ready to go through an assessment. If we look at both the DIBCAC joint surveillance assessment process, and if you look at the CMMC assessment process that was in the CAP or the certification assessment process document, there's a first step that is called a readiness review. And that's exactly what the DIBCAC or the C3PAO is going to do. They're going to ask for, they're going to ask questions like the ones we're going over now. They're going to ask for a base of documents like the system security plan. And on the basis of that information, they're going to make a determination and say, yes, we're ready and we believe that we should proceed and complete this assessment. Or they will say, no, we believe you are not ready and you need to go back and complete these items before we can complete an assessment. And self-assessment is just kind of one of those things on that list that if you've not done it, if you don't know what your SPRS score is, you absolutely are not ready to go through and complete an assessment.
So I'll follow up on, I get a phone call and I say I did a self-assessment. I looked at the 110 controls and I have a program of actions and milestones, a POAM for 90 of those. I did it, I checked the box and I'm working on 90 POAMs. Is that an adequate answer?
That's a great answer. Call me back when you've taken care of those 90 POAM items that under CMMC, 10% of the items, and it's only certain items of the 110 can be satisfied for a short period of time with a POAM. If you have 90 of them, you're a long way from being ready and certainly would not pass an assessment.
Well, let's move on to the third question that is asked for this readiness review. And this one, I'd appreciate a very brief answer from you because you've covered this in the prior section. The question you'll be asked is, what is your SPRS score? When was it last submitted? Do you have documentary evidence to support it? So what's a good answer?
The answer is yes. And the answer is we do have sufficient documentation to support our answer. And then the follow-on to that is that's sufficient as speaking from the organization's perspective, our sufficient evidence would meet the standard expected for DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020, and of course the CMMC rule, because that evidentiary standard is the same.
And the system security plan and associated documentation is one of the key pieces of evidence.
Yes, sir.
To provide evidence that you actually diligently computed your SPRS score. Is that correct?
It is. And when you're doing your SPRS score, the accuracy is everything. Because remember, fundamentally, you are attesting to the government that this is the current state of our organization. Whether it's negligence or whether it's willful negligence or ignorance, the reality is you are writing this down and submitting it to the government, and they will not forget. So I would caution you to do so with accuracy and in the appropriate due diligence.
Next question. Have you implemented a change management process? And if so, what's its governance? What's the right answer? What's the change management process? And what indicates shortfalls?
Again, this is an absolutely fundamental requirement, but it's one of those things that we as a C3PAO will look at very carefully. It's something that if you go through a DIBCAC assessment and just very simply put, when you complete an assessment, whether it's a CMMC assessment, whether it's your self-assessment, whether it's a DIB-CAC assessment, it's kind of a point in time. It's based on how your IT was configured at that point in time, your policies and procedures at that point in time, your facilities at that point in time, and what the configuration management or change management process does is it ensures that as you make any changes to your IT, if you make any changes to your policies and procedures, they have been reviewed formally to ensure that they will still satisfy these requirements. And so it's a matter of knowing, that systems will continue to evolve, organizations will continue to evolve. Do you have a process that as those things change, grow, and develop to ensure that you're still maintaining compliance or satisfying that set of requirements under 800-171 and under the DFARS 7012?
Next question. Thank you for the clear answer. You're likely to be asked again by Stuart and his, team or DIB-CAC. Do you have a formal set of policies and procedures that you maintain and follow? What's the right answer? What are they talking about? And what indicates?
Yeah, so the answer is that remember that policies govern, that they tell the company what the requirements are that you have to meet. So your policy should tell you you have to meet all of these requirements related to the basic types of CUI that you have in your environment. And the policy should state that if you have other categories of controlled and classified information in your environment, for example, controlled technical information along with export controlled information or some other category, that you have to also meet the specified requirements as well, because you do. Your procedures should, one last thing on policies, your policy should provide oversight authority for the implementation and for the monitoring and enforcement of those requirements. So your policies should provide the sufficient detail that provides the organization, this is the requirement, this is how we provide oversight, and we monitor this requirement, and this is how we enforce it. The policies and procedures are defined in a very specific way. And this is the only thing, or one of the few things, that I would implement at the very beginning right now. You need to understand what the definition for both policy and procedure states in the CMMC glossary, because it's very, very specific. And I would implement the definitions for policies and procedures right now, even though it is a CMMC specific definition. Number one, it will serve you well. Number two is that it will ensure that as you implement the requirements and as you write these policies, you don't do it a second time. Because if you do it right and do it right the first time, meaning meet the definition and requirements in the CMMC glossary for procedure and for policy, it will take you through the entire journey underneath the 7012, underneath the 7019 and 20, and preparation for CMMC certification quite well. So follow those definitions, follow exactly what they say, and structure your policies and your procedures exactly with the descriptions as those glossary terms provide.
Yeah, and remember that that not all of the requirements are technical. A number of them are things on how your organization functions, what your organization does, and that's really the role of the policies and the procedures and why they are so important to all of this.
So again, to simplify over here, our policies and procedures, things as an example, hey, here's us how we protect CUI. Here's the training that we have provided. Here's the policy that exists in the company to ensure that the appropriate personnel that handle CUI have been given appropriate training to handle the tools, the right email, the file sharing services that they're using to handle CUI, etc., in the proper way. Is that what you're talking about?
So I think that's exactly it. I mean, we'll have a policy, that states that before any employee is provided access to CUI, they must complete a background check. They must complete a series of comprehensive training that covers security risks and handling CUI. That can be the policy. The procedure are the steps by which we're submitting somebody for a background check. They're the steps by which we instruct somebody to be able to go and complete training and how we validate that that training has occurred and the procedure then for granting them access. The policy provides the overview and the procedure talks about how that policy is implemented.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question you are likely to be asked is that, do the cloud services or applications you use to store and share controlled unclassified information satisfy the FedRAMP baseline, moderate, or equivalent? So what evidence should a company be looking for if it's using an email or file sharing system or any other system to store and share CUI? What evidence must they provide that the cloud provider is meeting FedRAMP moderate, baseline, or equivalent?
So I think that this is a very important area that has a lot of misunderstanding, and there really lacks sufficient detail to help most organizations know what they need to do. Number one is that underneath the DFARS 7012, you're required to meet this as a cloud service provider, this FedRAMP moderate or equivalent standard. And so the question is, well, who does that impact? So that impacts any external system that's connected to your organization that processes, stores, or transmits CUI, okay? Or it's an organization that may have access. That means the opportunity or the ability to access CUI underneath that, as it's defined underneath the DoD I-5248, which is a DoD policy. So if an organization external to you, for example, an ERP or and a cloud services provider that helps you store CUI or provides you backups for your environment, right? Or a managed service provider that processes, stores, or transmits CUI, they are going to have to meet these cloud service provider requirements. That will not change, folks. There's a lot of misinformation that people are hoping that somehow the rules will change. They are not going to change. DoD has been very clear on this. So when, go ahead. Stuart.
Yeah, I was going to say, and so I think for organizations to understand, how do I know, or what's the body of evidence? If an organization has gone through the FedRAMP process, right, has an ATO or an authority to operate that's either been issued by the FedRAMP PMO or by the JAB, that right, constitutes evidence that it's satisfied that requirement. They've gone through that process. If an organization hasn't gone through that process, and many haven't, because you need to be providing service to a government agency to go through the FedRAMP process, then typically the body of evidence that will be deemed acceptable is going through a similar process or an assessment by a FedRAMP 3PAO, a third-party assessment organization, who will assess you against those requirements, complete a SAR or the security audit report, and provide a management letter that says, as a consequence of the audit that they have taken on the basis of their role as an authorized 3PAO, that they believe that this organization has satisfied those requirements. It's a pretty important bar, either to be able to have an ATO or to go through the process with a FedRAMP 3PAO who will say they've taken you through the process, and that as a result of that, it's their opinion that you've satisfied the requirements in the FedRAMP moderate baseline.
Yeah, and if you're an organization out there,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
If you're an organization out there that meets the definition for cloud service provider underneath NIST 800 or NIST 500-292, in my opinion, I think that Coalfire is the only, it may not be, but I believe it is the only organization that's taken a cloud service provider out there through that entire process and been recognized by the DoD as having met the equivalent requirements. So heed Stuart's guidance well, because he knows this process. They've done it before, and you should not leave it to chance or uncertainty or ambiguity if you do not know whether you're an organization that has to meet these requirements.
Yeah, this is one area that we, PreVeil handles in email and files, encrypted, controlled and classified information. And just as Stuart said, we follow the exact same long and difficult process where we first met all the FedRAMP moderate baseline controls ourselves, then went through two independent audits. The first year, and then in accordance with the ATO regulations, got ourselves re-audited to show that we are continuing to abide by the rules. And so we provide, again, a management letter, an independent letter of attestation from the third-party assessment organization, as well as a very thorough body of evidence and security assessment report to prove that if you're using us for CUI, here's how we meet FedRAMP baseline moderate equivalent. Let's move on to the last question that will be likely asked. If you use encryption to protect CUI, do you use FIPS 140-2 or later? What evidence constitutes that you're actually using FIPS 140-2? Is it just as I say, I use 140-2, or is there some level of attestation or validation that I, as a service provider, need to provide you that my FIPS is actually validated?
You want to hit this, Stuart?
Well, so, generally it's a matter of looking at, the software product or looking at the hardware product that's involved. And the key term is validated. And so the validation is occurring by a third-party laboratory. There are a few of those that are qualified and entitled to provide this validation. And it would be a matter of being able to, ask for that evidence. And generally that evidence is available through either the software component that is providing the encryption or the hardware device that is providing that encryption, indicating that they've gone through that process. And the fact that it is following FIPS 140-2 has been externally validated. So
they should be able to provide a certificate that actually verifies with this body of evidence. Remember, they should probably, depending upon what the purpose of the FIPS is, they'll provide a shared responsibility matrix or additional literal certificates if it's a hardware manufacturer that says this device with this operating system and these version control meets this specific FIPS 140-2, and here is the actual number certificate that proves that.
And I think both with this and the FedRAMP moderate, it's a matter of, this is about trust. You're trusting a third-party system to be able to store information that is sensitive. How do you know that it is trusted? It's going through that, that very onerous process to that high bar to demonstrate it satisfies FedRAMP, or with respect to encryption of data at rest, data in transit, to being able to show that in fact it is protected through an encryption mechanism that has been validated with objective evidence to demonstrate that.
So in all these cases, what is literally happening over and over again is, if you are using services from a cloud provider and say they're required to meet FedRAMP, don't take their word for it. Ask for third-party assessment and objective evidence. If it's FIPS, it's the same thing. Validation must be provided by a third-party validation and an appropriate certificate associated with it. And really, this is what's happening with the CMMC process, that if you say you're compliant, you will be, in some time when the thing becomes law, be able to provide a third-party assessment that says, yes, I indeed meet that. So those were the 7 questions that you are likely to be asked, and appropriate answers to them and inappropriate answers to them. So let's move on to some of the important audience questions. We have time for one very important and recurring question that comes up. And it goes something like this. It says that, hey, I'm a company that has a DFARS 7012 clause, but I looked for and I didn't find documents or stuff that's marked controlled unclassified information. Does that mean that I'm off the hook? I don't need to comply with NIST 800-171 or DFARS because basically I couldn't find CUI. So Regan and Stuart, could you tell us a little bit about the CUI discovery process and clarify for such an organization if they're indeed off the hook?
Yeah, so I was just addressing one of the questions, which is a great question, coincides with this. There's some fundamental issues here, folks. One is that CUI is developed or received in performance of a contract, and that CUI falls underneath the DFARS 7012 Covered Defense Information definition. There are two components to that definition. It's very important that you know this. The first component is that it's marked or otherwise identified in the contract, which is the appropriate thing to do according to DoD policy. But the other component to that definition is the second part, and it is one or the other, not and. The or part is that it is received, developed, transmitted, stored, and secured in performance of on behalf of the government in performance of the contract. That means that the government recognizes that you are going to receive information that is not properly marked or otherwise identified in the contract. It is received and developed in performance of the contract. And 32 CFR specifically states that if information qualifies as CUI, whether it's marked or unmarked, then it must be protected according to the requirements. So you as an authorized holder are responsible for meeting all the CUI requirements according to the category definition related to the contract performance when it's received or developed, and most organizations will develop far more CUI than they receive. So it's vital that you know that these requirements apply to you. And so when you go through the CUI discovery process, remember that's going to define the entire organization, the scope of the assessment, remember what individuals have been authorized to be an authorized user, what devices will be authorized to process, store, transmit CUI and performance of the contract, and so on and so forth. So that CUI discovery process begins with understanding what do we do in performance of the contract, and what information do we need to receive to execute the contract, and what information that we have to develop in performance of the contract, and what's the traceability throughout the organization, whether it's in the business workflow, whether it's in the design and manufacturing process, or whether it's in the sharing of that information as we receive it, or the sharing of the information down to our suppliers in performance of the contract.
Right. And then that to Sanjeev's comment is you're not off the hook. You'll receive information that is not marked. You'll see information that may be mismarked. If you ask a contracting officer, the contracting officer may not have the right answer. And so it really ends up being your responsibility to be able to determine what is the CUI you're receiving, what is the CUI you're creating, and you have an obligation to appropriately mark it. But don't trust that what you receive is, if it's not marked, it's not CUI, or in some cases, even if it is marked, that it is CUI.
Well, with that clear answer, we are at 2 o'clock, and in accordance with the PreVeil webinar policy, we start on time and we end on time. I'd like to thank you both for your insightful answers, and to the audience for participating. And we hope that you got value in your effort to become, more prepared for complying with your current DFARS and upcoming CMMC requirements. Thank you for joining us.
Sanjeev, thank you for having us.
Thank you, Sanjeev, as always.